Hello and welcome to On Air with Sandaire. Today we are at Carlton House Terrace, home to the British Academy for Humanities and Social Sciences. We are hosting top questions that families of wealth ask. On our panel of speakers we have Tom McCullough, Chairman and CEO of Northwood Family Office, Peter Leach, partner of Deloitte UK, Juliette Johnson, founder of Juliette Johnson Consultancy, and Caroline Burkart, senior consultant with Scorpio Partnership.
Our third topic is a really important area and in some ways underpins a lot of what we've been discussing so far, but it's that of planning. So Caroline, let's go back to you with your research on planning.
So obviously I think, when we all talk about planning, it's all about sort of, who's going to get what, etc., and how it's all going to happen. But quite often what does get forgotten is that the individuals in a family who actually may not want to have to inherit that money or don't want to be involved in dealing with that money afterwards. So it's really important also to know who is going to be involved within the family in that process and who is going to sit out as a passive member. And again, through our research, we found that 32% of those that inherited wealth in the past now have a comprehensive strategy in place for the next generation. And that helped them in terms of increasing their confidence in what the next generation were going to do with that money and how they were going to manage it. So again, it's very important to be thinking about that planning piece, both in terms of who is going to be getting the money and again, how it is going to be used. And that cross-generational discussion is so important in terms of having this open conversation.
Tom, you're looking in that book again. What's it telling us about planning?
All sorts of good things. Families who have a business background, entrepreneurial background, they get that in their businesses. They do that for their businesses, but for the family, somehow it just doesn't happen very much. And it seems to me it's a small shift that would have a very big impact. So planning for most families is absolutely vital, and most people want to jump right into doing something. You know that expression, ready, fire, aim. It's out of order. There's some aiming that's required. And a little bit of aiming makes quite a bit of difference in terms of the management and planning for cash flow, for timing. I talked about goals at the beginning and understanding what your goals are. Families have balance sheets. So like a company has a balance sheet. So on one side of the balance sheet is assets, houses and investments and businesses. And the other side of the balance sheet are liabilities. So that's typically debt. But for a lot of wealthy families, there isn't debt, except maybe there's an operating line in the business or a line of credit for convenience. So what are liabilities for wealthy families? Good question. Liabilities for wealthy families are self-imposed. So how much do we spend? We spend £1 million a year or £500,000 a year. And we want to leave money to our children. Well, yes, we do. Well, that's a liability that has to be funded, either from income or from assets. And some liabilities are very short-term and very high priority. Sending 4 children to US universities, for example, that you add all that up, it's quite a lot of money. That should be thought of differently than money that's going to go to children in 40 years' time. You can think of it differently. So it's a little bit like air travel. There's at least 3 goals in air travel. 1 is arriving safely, 2 is arriving on time, and 3 is comfort. Well, you want the probability of the safe arrival to be extremely high. So you want, think about that as really, really vital goals if you want to use it in a financial sense. And then there's goals that are more, on-time arrival is great. You want a pretty high percentage probability of that. But comfort, it's great, but you don't have to have it. So there's different kinds of goals in air travel, but different kinds of goals in financial management as well, and they require different kinds of solutions. So a little bit of that kind of planning is very, very helpful. And then there's the whole planning to pass money on to the next generation and how to have those conversations. What if there's a common asset that is owned, like a vacation property or an estate, or what about planning for your death? All of those things are extremely important, but we tend to spend a lot more time and energy focused on things like, which particular asset or money manager or product is required, and less time on those substantive planning areas. And I think it's really important for families to do that.
Peter, is there a formulaic approach to planning, or what would you say?
I don't think there's a formulaic approach to planning, but just picking up what Tom's saying, I have a slight issue with his family balance sheet, because actually I think one of the key things that a lot of people think is the key asset in the family's balance sheet is the family harmony. And the thing that gets in the way of the family harmony is the lack of planning around the money and the wealth. And in your research, I wonder if you've ever done research to show what happens to the relationships if the planning isn't done, and the patriarch or the matriarch goes, and the kids then fall out and squabble. And if you look at the arguments that occur all over the world in terms of next generation squabbling, it's because it wasn't done when the patriarch was alive. And it generally is because the patriarch or the matriarch didn't want to go there because it's in a box called too difficult. So I think that you've got to do the planning. There's no formulaic way of doing that. It's iterative. It is incredibly sensitive and incredibly difficult, and it's a minefield, and you just have to avoid stepping on the mines and going extremely slowly and bringing people along at the same time. It's a very, very, very difficult area, and I'm afraid I don't think anybody can say that they know what the right answer is, because I don't think there is a right answer.
There's no prescriptive process.
No, there's no prescription for this. It is about process, iteration and dialogue. And if you don't, good communication, everyone talks about communication, but communication comes from good relationships. If you don't have good relationships, you're not going to have good communication. So you can't start doing the communicating until you fix the relationships. And a lot of people start communicating before you fix the relationships, in which case that's going to hit a wall. So the communication thing is a much deeper, much harder thing to do than it appears on the surface.
Absolutely. Juliette, with that in mind, what does the international market look like? Is it cultural differences again on planning?
Well, absolutely. I mean, you know, in some cultures, you know, it's very disrespectful to talk about death and the idea that your parents are going to be gone one day. So again, it's not talked about and it's dictated from above. And I completely agree with what Peter said about family harmony. And often the family harmony breaks down because people feel it's not fair. Whatever's being planned isn't fair. What's fairness is fairness, equality, treating everybody equally. And even if you're treating everybody equally, does that mean giving them exactly the same thing? You know, it doesn't work in a family. Families need to start with thinking about what's the purpose of their wealth. What's it there to achieve? And I hear lots of conversations from the next generation, again, who want to start their own businesses, and will they get funding from the family? And all of that sort of stuff needs planning as well, because it's not as simple as, oh, we'll write you a cheque and off you go, set up your business. You know, what happens if it goes brilliantly well? Who owns it? How does it all work? What happens if it all goes horribly wrong? And what does that mean in the context of the family and those other siblings who maybe haven't gone down that route? So it's really complicated, and the more families can sit and think about what's it for. And often you see that the older generation who have generated the wealth, what they see as being the purpose of the wealth is completely different from what their children see as the purpose of the wealth. And, you know, when they set up their enterprises, it was often about survival and entrepreneurship and doing what they wanted to do. For the next generation, that doesn't often excite them. They've grown up in a very different environment.
If you go around the world and look at different cultures where there are prescribed laws about inheritance, and let's take the Sharia, for example. I'm not here trying to sell Sharia law to the UK market, so please don't misunderstand it. But what actually happens in the Arab world is they don't actually have the same kind of arguments, because the choices are not the same. They have the ability to do limited things when they're alive. On passing, there's a prescription as to how it works, and it's actually quite simple. The spouse gets an eighth, and the boys will always get double the girls. It's not that complicated, and you can always do the maths. But what happens is, because it's cultural and it's in the system, everybody knows where they stand. They can't argue with it because you cannot beat the Sharia court. However hard you try, you just won't get there. And you won't try because it'll take you 30 years to get a ruling anyway, so you're not going to do that. But if you look at the number of disputes that arise in the West, where there is free choice, it's much more than where there are some prescriptions. Now, I'm not suggesting prescriptions are the answer, but they have a very significant effect on the way this works. And picking up Juliette's point about is equal fair or is it equitable, the one thing that the Sharia does is it ensures that it's equitable. It doesn't have to be fair, but it has to be equitable. And I think there are some lessons learned to that. And some families have their own version of this, and they create their own family law, LORE, when they do it, and they say, this is how we're going to do it. And every family can write their own LORE if they want to, but in today's world, they have to make sure they convert it to LAW, otherwise it won't work.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we've probably only scratched the surface of all of these really, really interesting issues, but please join me in thanking our very illustrious and eminent panel for their fascinating insights into these subjects, please.